There is a man standing in a kitchen in England in the year 1300. His name is Gilbert. He is a cook. In his right hand, a swan. Not a metaphor, a literal swan, plucked, cleaned, ready for the spit. It will be roasted, gilded with saffron, redressed in its own feathers, and carried to the Lord's table on a silver dish. The cost of the spices alone, the saffron, the ginger, the pepper, exceeds what Gilbert earns in a month. In his left hand, a ladle. The ladle will go into a pot of peas and onions that has been simmering since this morning. That pot is for the kitchen staff, for Gilbert, for his family when he brings the leftovers home. Same kitchen, same fire, same hands. Two completely different worlds on either side of one door. This is what the archive holds today. Not the story of famine and plague and peasants starving in the fields. The story of a man who could see both tables from where he stood, and who understood better than anyone else in that house exactly what separated them. I'm Paul. Welcome back. Let's open the record. Gilbert was born into a family of free peasants in a village in southern England. His father grew grain. His mother baked bread. Not the bread you are thinking of. Dark bread, dense bread. Bread made from rye and barley and whatever grain was left at the end of the season. The kind of bread that kept you alive, but did not taste of anything much. Gilbert ate that bread every day of his childhood, with peas, with beans, with onions when there were onions, with pottage, a thick boiled stew of whatever was available, and peas, always peas. He drank ale, weak ale, brewed at home, because the water was not safe and ale was safer. He ate meat perhaps 4 times a year, a pig at Christmas, something at Easter, a rabbit if his father could get one without the Lord noticing. This was not poverty by the standards of his time. This was the ordinary life of an ordinary English family in the year 1280. When Gilbert was 12, he went to work in the kitchens of the local lord, not because he chose it, because the lord's steward came to his village looking for kitchen boys, and Gilbert was quick and paid attention. He spent the next 30 years learning to cook for people who ate nothing like he had eaten as a child, and in doing so, he saw something that most people in his world never had the chance to see. He saw both tables. The Lord's table was not just a place to eat. It was a performance. Every feast, and there were many feasts, the great lords feasted on average 3 times a week, was designed to communicate one thing above all others: power. Gilbert understood this because it was his job to make it visible. The centerpiece of any great feast was not the food, it was the display. Roasted peacock, redressed in its own feathers, placed back together so it looked alive. Swans gilded with real saffron, a spice worth more per ounce than silver. Subtleties, sugar sculptures, shaped like castles, like ships, like the Lord's coat of arms. Not to eat, to look at, to impress the guests, to say, I can afford to waste sugar on something decorative. Gilbert made all of it. He had learned that the spices were the key. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, saffron, nutmeg, cardamom, all of them imported from the Far East, all of them transported across thousands of miles by merchant networks that stretched from England to India. A pound of pepper in 1300 cost roughly the same as a week's wages for a skilled craftsman. A pound of saffron cost more than a horse. The Lord did not use spices because they tasted good, though they did. He used them because everyone in the room knew what they cost.
Every dish that arrived at the high table, heavy with cinnamon and ginger, was a statement. I am powerful enough to eat this. You are not. Gilbert knew this. He ground the spices himself. He weighed them carefully. He added them deliberately. And he was good at it. He was proud of his work. And he hated what it meant.
I want to take you into the kitchen, because the Lord's table did not happen by itself. Behind every feast, behind every gilded swan and every sugar castle and every dish heavy with pepper and cinnamon, was a room that most guests never saw. Gilbert's room. A great lord's kitchen in 1300 was not one person with one fire. It was a machine. At the top, the master cook, Gilbert in this house. Below him, roasters who managed the spits, pastry cooks who made the pastry shells that held the meat, sauce makers who ground the spices and prepared the liquids, kitchen boys who fetched and carried and kept the fires burning. 10, 15, 20 people in a large household, all working under Gilbert's direction from before dawn until after dark on feast days. The pressure was real. A feast was not a meal. A feast was a political event. If the sauce was wrong, if the pepper was too little or the saffron too pale, guests would notice. Guests were supposed to notice. That was the point. Gilbert had once seen a cook dismissed because a subtlety, a sugar sculpture, had collapsed before it reached the table, not because anyone went hungry, because the performance had failed. The ingredients arrived at the kitchen under lock and key. Spices were kept in a locked chest to which only the steward and Gilbert had access, not because they were afraid Gilbert was stealing them, though theft was possible, because spices were currency. A pound of pepper cost more than a week's wages for a skilled craftsman. Saffron, the threads of crocus that Gilbert used to gild the swan, cost more per ounce than silver. When Gilbert weighed the saffron before a feast, he was handling something that had traveled from the eastern Mediterranean across thousands of miles of merchant roads to reach his kitchen in rural England. He understood what it meant. He had priced it himself when the Lord Steward asked him to calculate the cost of a feast. The ingredients for one great feast, one feast for perhaps 30 guests, could have fed Thomas's family for 6 months. Gilbert knew this. He had done the calculation more than once. He ground the spices, he stoked the fire, he checked the swan turning on the spit, basting it with the saffron liquid, watching the color change from pale to gold. It was beautiful work. He was good at it. And he hated that he was good at it. Not the cooking itself. The cooking he loved. The knowing, the quiet daily knowing of what the cooking meant, that was the weight he carried out of the kitchen every night.
Let me show you what Gilbert understood about food in medieval England that we have largely forgotten. Food was not primarily about nutrition. It was not primarily about pleasure. It was a language. And like all languages, it communicated who you were, where you belonged, and how much distance existed between you and everyone else. The grammar of that language was precise. White bread, made from refined wheat flour, sifted multiple times, soft and pale and expensive. This was the bread of the Lord's table. Black bread, made from rye, barley, oats, coarser, darker, cheaper. This was the bread of everyone else. You did not choose which bread you ate. Your position chose for you, and everyone in the room could read the choice at a glance. The salt cellar sat on the Lord's table. At a great feast, guests were seated in relation to the salt. Above the salt, family, important guests, allies. They received the best food, the most spiced dishes, the white bread. Below the salt, lesser guests, servants, petitioners. They received plainer food, less spice, darker bread. The salt cellar was not just a condiment, it was a social map. Gilbert watched this every time he served a feast. He watched the steward arrange the seating. He watched guests calculate their position relative to the salt.
He watched the food arrive in different forms at different parts of the table. The same roast, but the Lord received the best cut, heavily spiced. The guests below the salt received the outer pieces, less seasoned, sometimes reheated from the day before. Food did not just reflect the social order. Food was the social order, made edible, served on a plate, eaten 3 times a day. Gilbert understood this better than anyone because he was the one who made it. He decided how much spice went into which dish. He decided which cut went to which part of the table. Within the kitchen, he had a power that reversed the order of the hall. At the Lord's table, the Lord controlled everything. At Gilbert's fire, Gilbert controlled everything. He never forgot that.
Now, let me show you the other side of Gilbert's world, the side he came from, the side his brother still lived in. His brother's name was Thomas. Thomas had stayed in the village. He farmed the same strip of land their father had farmed. He ate the same food their father had eaten. In a year, a typical year, not a famine year, not a plague year, just an ordinary year in rural England around 1300, Thomas would eat approximately 365 loaves of bread. Dark bread, rye and barley, sometimes maslin, rye mixed with wheat when the wheat was affordable. He would eat peas and beans almost every day. Pottage, the thick boiled stew, for most of his meals. He would eat onions. He would eat turnips when they were available. He would eat cabbage. He would drink ale, between 1 and 2 gallons a day, weak ale, low in alcohol, because ale had calories and water had disease. He would eat meat perhaps 8 to 12 times a year. At Christmas, pork, possibly at Easter. Herrings, dried and salted, technically fish, which the church permitted, during the 40 days of Lent and the 150 other fast days scattered through the calendar. 150 fast days. The church had decided that abstaining from meat was an act of spiritual discipline, and in a world where the church controlled the calendar, Thomas had no choice. Meat on a fast day was a sin. But here is what the archive shows most clearly. Thomas was not malnourished, not in an ordinary year. His diet, bread, peas, beans, ale, occasional meat, provided adequate calories. It was monotonous, it was constrained, it was completely determined by his position in society and the church's calendar, but it kept him alive. What it did not do, what it could never do, was communicate power. Thomas's food said one thing about Thomas. He was at the bottom. Not because it tasted bad, because of what it was made of, because of what it lacked, because of what he could not afford and was not permitted to eat even when he could. Gilbert knew all of this. He brought leftovers home from the Lord's kitchen when he could, scraps of roasted meat, bread, white bread, sometimes, from the hall. His children ate better than Thomas's children, not because Gilbert was powerful, because Gilbert stood next to power every day, and the crumbs fell his way.
I need to show you one more mechanism that controlled what medieval people ate. Not the Lord, not the market, not the harvest, the church. The medieval church did not just control your spiritual life. It controlled your calendar, and your calendar controlled your plate. In a typical year in England around 1300, there were approximately 150 days on which meat was forbidden. 150 days, more than 1/3 of the year. Every Friday, in memory of Christ's death. Every Saturday, in honor of the Virgin. The 40 days of Lent before Easter. Advent before Christmas. The vigils of major saints' days. Ember days, 4 sets of 3 days scattered through the seasons. On these days, no meat, no animal products in many interpretations, no lard, no butter, sometimes no eggs. Fish was permitted, vegetables were permitted, bread was permitted, but meat, the food that most clearly communicated power and plenty, was forbidden. The church called it discipline, an exercise in restraint, a reminder that the body serves the soul. Gilbert understood the theology. What he also understood, standing in his kitchen preparing two versions of the same fast, was that even fasting had a hierarchy. The Lord's Lenten table was not Thomas's Lenten table, not even close. For the Lord on a fast day, fresh river pike, poached in wine and spices, bream and perch from the Lord's own fish ponds, almond milk made from ground almonds imported from the Mediterranean, used in place of cow's milk to make rich sauces and creamy pottages, dried figs and dates, white fish from the coast transported in salt. Gilbert prepared all of this. For Thomas, on a fast day, salt herring, the cheapest preserved fish available, perhaps dried stockfish, cod, hard as wood, requiring hours of soaking before it could be eaten, dark bread, water, or weak ale. Both men were fasting. Both men were following the church's instructions. Both men were expressing their submission to God's calendar. But one man's fast featured almond milk and river pike. The other man's fast featured salt herring and water. The church had created a shared spiritual discipline. What the world had done with it was create two versions, one for each table. Gilbert saw this with particular clarity because he made both versions, on the same day, in the same kitchen, with the same fire. He prepared the almond milk sauce for the Lord's pike. He counted out the salt herrings for the kitchen staff's meal. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. This was simply how the world worked. The church had said, fast and be equal before God. The kitchen said, fast but not equally. Gilbert ground the almonds. Thomas salted his herring. And the fast day passed like every other day, with the gap intact, expressed on a plate, blessed by the church, enforced by the calendar, 150 times a year.
This is the second mechanism. 2 tables, 1 kingdom, 1 kitchen. Gilbert stood between them every day of his working life. On one side, the Lord's table, roasted swan, saffron, pepper worth more than silver, white bread, wine from Bordeaux, sugar sculptures, a feast designed to say, this is what power looks like when it sits down to eat. On the other side, Thomas's table, pottage, dark bread, ale, dried fish in Lent, peas, always peas. Gilbert could see both, and what he saw was not just a difference in food. He saw a difference in time. The Lord's table existed outside of time in a certain sense. Spices from India, wine from France, sugar from the Mediterranean. The ingredients had traveled months or years to reach that plate. The Lord ate the whole world at every meal. Thomas's table existed entirely in place. What grew within walking distance, what could be stored through winter, what the Lord permitted, what the church allowed. Thomas ate the village, nothing beyond it. Gilbert fed both men from the same fire, and he understood, with the clarity that comes from using your hands to make the difference visible, that the food was not just a result of the gap between them. The food was the gap. Every meal reproduced it. Every feast deepened it. Every fast day reminded everyone of what they could and couldn't have, and who decided. Gilbert thought about this in the quiet hours before dawn, when the kitchen fires were being stoked and the day's work was beginning. He was not a rebel. He was not going to do anything about it. He was a cook. His job was to feed people. But he saw it. And seeing it clearly, day after day, feast after feast for 30 years, is its own kind of knowledge. The archive holds it.
In 1348, the Black Death arrived in England. Gilbert was dead by then, his records end around 1320. But his son worked in the same kitchen, and his son watched what happened to the world his father had described. In 2 years, between 1348 and 1350, roughly half the population of England died.
half. The village where Thomas had farmed lost 12 of its 30 families. The fields were there, the grain was there, the people to work them were not. And something extraordinary happened. The survivors started demanding more, not through revolution, not through war, through scarcity. There were not enough workers to bring in the harvest. The lords needed them, and the workers, for the first time in centuries, could ask for more. More wages, more food, more meat. The church still had its fast days. The lords still had their swan. But Thomas's grandson was eating meat 3 times a week by 1380, not because anyone decided the gap should close, because the plague had changed the arithmetic. The specialness of food, the way a swan announced power, the way peas announced poverty, did not disappear, but it shifted. The spice trade changed too. When Portuguese ships found the sea route to India in the late 1400s, the long overland route through the Middle East was bypassed. Pepper got cheaper. Spices got cheaper. What had been worth more than silver became available to the merchant class, and the lords, who had used spices to announce their distance from everyone else, had to find new ways to perform their power. The food language changed its vocabulary, but the grammar remained. What you eat still says who you are. It still says where you belong. It still says how much distance exists between you and everyone else. We just don't call it above the salt and below the salt anymore. We call it something else.
The archive holds one more record. Not a document. A moment. Gilbert, in his kitchen. Late afternoon. The feast being prepared. The swan on the spit. The saffron measured. The sugar sculpture almost complete. And somewhere, a mile away in the village where he grew up, his brother Thomas is sitting down to his evening meal. Peas, dark bread, ale. The same meal Thomas will eat tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Gilbert knows this. He has known it every day for 30 years. He grinds the pepper. He bastes the swan. He does his job. He is good at his job. But he knows what the swan costs, and he knows what Thomas is eating. And the distance between them, measured not in miles but in spices, in bread color, in the presence or absence of a roasted bird on a silver dish, is the distance this archive is about. Not the distance between the powerful and the powerless, the distance between what we can see and what we choose to look at. Gilbert could see both tables. Most people only ever see one.
That is what the archive held today. Not the story of famine and plague and peasants starving, the story of a man who stood between 2 tables every day of his working life, who ground the spices that announced one world and brought home the scraps that fed another, and of a food system that was not accidental, that was designed not by any single person, but by centuries of habit and hierarchy and church to make the gap visible 3 times a day, every meal, every feast, every fast. If this changed the way you see something, share it with one person. That is how this archive grows. And if you haven't subscribed to Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire yet, the doors are open. Next time, I'll take you to a different shelf entirely. The archive is deep, and what's on the next shelf you won't expect. I'm Paul, archivist of Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire. Stay curious and keep reading.